Now that you've been exposed to a variety of different mindfulness and compassion practices, it may be helpful to step back and look at when each of the various techniques might be most useful to use. When we had the Dalai Lama at Harvard Medical School, my colleagues and I had thought it would be so wonderful. Let's have him lead a group of 1,100 psychotherapists in some mindfulness meditation practice. So at the appointed time, my colleague asked the Dalai Lama to please lead all of us. And he, in his inimitable way, started laughing. He thought, what will these silly people come up with next? Then he said, I think some of you may want just one single meditation, and a simple one that's 100% positive. That, I think, is impossible. There are a whole lot of different outlooks toward oneself, toward suffering, toward the whole world. And because of that, in order to transform our destructive emotion, one goal, there are so many thousands of different meditations that are mentioned. He went on to say that here, on the basis of my own experience, I can say that for one single type of meditation, its effect is limited. After a little bit more discussion, he said this. He said, some other sort of companies, they always advertise some simple thing, something effective, something very cheap. My advertising is just the opposite. How difficult and complicated. This question of which practice to use when and for whom is actually a cutting-edge area of investigation for mental health professionals who are using mindfulness practices now in psychotherapy. Because different clients or patients have such varied needs, clinicians want to be careful to introduce the most effective practices and particularly to avoid those that might be harmful for particular individuals at particular moments. While we don't yet have experimental research data to guide us, accumulating clinical experience is providing some direction. And here are a number of choices that my colleagues and I consider in our clinical work, and they can be useful for any of us doing mindfulness practice in deciding how to tailor our practice to our particular needs. There are 7 decisions, and in the course of this lecture, I'll outline what all of them are about. The first one is which skills to emphasize between concentration, open monitoring, and acceptance practices, when to do formal or informal practice, which objects of attention, when to pay attention to the breath, when to pay attention to other things, whether to take these in as religious or secular practices, whether to work with life difficulties in what we could call a narrative or experiencing mode, and I'll explain that, whether to stay at the level of relative truth, which is kind of our everyday look at the world, or absolute truth, truth as it's revealed through these practices, and finally, and most importantly, when to do practices that turn towards safety and give us a sense of safety and soothing, and when to do practices that help us to reintegrate bits of experience that are difficult and we may have pushed out of awareness. Let's start with the first choice. I mentioned earlier that there are 3 fundamental mindfulness skills. And some practices emphasize one more than the other. How might we choose among them? Well, the 3 skills are focused attention or concentration, and we use that to observe things clearly, to refine the focus of the mind. The second one is open monitoring, and that's to see how the mind creates suffering. And the third is acceptance or loving kindness practices, and this also might include compassion practices and equanimity practices, and these are used to soothe and comfort us. And we can think of these as 3 legs of a tripod. Typically, most of us have to develop concentration first, because until we develop concentration, the mind is simply too scattered to be able to carefully observe what's happening in each moment. Once we have sufficient concentration, that's when we move on to open monitoring or choiceless awareness. That's when we can broaden the field of awareness to pay attention to whatever arises in our consciousness. Then, if we notice a lot of resistance to the contents, if we notice that we're filled with self-critical thoughts, judgments, resistance to certain aspects of what's coming up, that's when the loving kindness or metta practices are so helpful, as well as the self-compassion practices and equanimity practices, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We also talked about the continuum of practice, informal practices that we can do during the day, formal meditation practice, and intensive retreat practices. For most of us, it helps to pick a few informal practices like dog walking, showering, and mindful driving, for example, and each time we're in those circumstances to practice them. And to try to then pick regular times of the day for formal practices. So to do them in the morning regularly or after work or in the evening. And for many people, it's helpful to engage in some kind of a class. One great way to take up a regular formal practice pattern is to attend a meditation class at a local meditation center and meet with people once a week and practice in the group, as well as receive ongoing instruction. A retreat practice only makes sense if we're at a time in our life when we're feeling like we're not overwhelmed, because retreats tend to be rather intense and can be emotionally overwhelming, but they also have the potential to deepen our practice profoundly. Now, when we do any practice, there are different objects of attention that we could use. So far, we've used mostly the breath for the longer practice. That's what you have in your recorded audio. But at the end of that audio, we also use other objects of awareness, such as the sensations of the buttocks and the feet and the backs of the legs touching the chair, sounds, sights, the sensation of the air. And different objects of awareness tend to have different effects on the mind. And we can think of these as arrayed on a kind of continuum from the more coarse to the more subtle. At the coarse level, it's things like walking meditation. If we're doing walking meditation and my feet are touching the ground and I'm stepping, lifting, stepping, that's a pretty vivid stimulus. Similarly, the sights and sounds of nature are pretty vivid, or the taste of food as an eating meditation, or perhaps the sound of a bell. A little bit more subtle are things like the breath in the belly that arises and passes, or perhaps the use of a mantra, a repeated phrase, or subtler still, the air at the tip of the nose, as was offered as an alternative in the recorded audio of breath meditation. Now, I frequently ask groups of psychotherapists who are meditators, I say, of you folks who meditate regularly, how many of you typically choose as your venue a heavy metal concert? And naturally, none of the hands go up. But we might ask, why not? A heavy metal concert offers the opportunity for paying attention to a very vivid stimulus. There are burning guitars, there's loud music, there's flashing lights, and we could equivalently think of other things like, do you usually go on roller coaster rides to meditate, or go to a over-the-top, expressive kind of opera? And no, we don't usually go for things that are intense like this. Actually, many of those very intense experiences appeal to people in part because they create a sense of absorption. We're so brought out of our own thought stream by the intense sensations of the heavy metal concert or of the roller coaster that we're not worrying about our usual concerns. There are other things. Intense sexual experiences can function in this way. But the problem is that when we're focusing on an object of awareness that's really, really intense, we tend not to see the subtle movements of the mind. So we don't get a lot of insight into how the mind creates suffering for itself. Now, another choice point, the fourth, involves choosing a suitable style. And this depends on our cultural background. Some of us are drawn toward spiritual practices or religious practices. And these may be in a devotional tradition or a theistic tradition. And it can often be helpful to choose a practice that fits your own cultural orientation or your own belief system. I remember when I went to sit my first silent meditation retreat, and this is in the mid-1970s, and I was kind of a countercultural person. And as I described before, during the retreat, you're not talking to the other participants, but there was this one group of guys who were dressed really oddly, odd to me. They had on robes, with their brown robes tied with a belt, and there were a lot of hippies around in those days that had weird outfits, but this was obviously something different. And I kept wondering, who are these folks and where are they from? Well, at the end of the retreat, I got to ask them. And it turned out that they were from a Trappist monastery that was down the block. And they were following the tradition of Thomas Merton, who had gone to the East to learn meditation practices to help in his monastic practices in the Catholic tradition. And among the folks who came and learned meditation was a fellow named Father Thomas Keating. And he developed something called contemplative prayer. It's also sometimes called centering prayer. And this is in the tradition of what's called the Lectio Divina, which means the holy reading of the scriptures. And it's about opening the heart and mind, our whole being to God, or the ultimate mystery, but the world and experience beyond thoughts, words, and emotions. So this is how they teach to do centering prayer. And as you'll see, it's a form of mindfulness practice. They choose a sacred word or symbol. In the case of centering prayer, it's usually from the Catholic liturgy. And they simply sit comfortably and introduce the sacred word and begin to repeat the sacred word over and over and have the word be the object of awareness. When the mind is distracted by a chain of narrative thought, the instruction is to ever so gently return the attention to the sacred word. And they do this for however long a period of practice, and then they end with 2 minutes of silence, which is typically just being with the breath. And while this was originally designed as a Catholic practice, the words could really come from any tradition, and it could work quite well with any spiritual or religious tradition that resonates for you. There are also recently a lot of Jewish adaptations of this. Often they'll use elements of the Kabbalah, which is the sort of mystical branch of Jewish tradition. And these may overlook differences in worldview, and there have been some critiques about this, saying that basically some Jewish theologians thinking that they don't want too much of a wholesale adaptation of some of these Buddhist views because they miss the relationship to a personal God. But these are catching on quite a bit. It turns out that in the United States, Jews are 2.5% of the population, and only 1.5% of the population, Jewish population, listed as a religion, but 25% of non-Asian Buddhists in America are of Jewish descent. So these, because there's such an interest in American Jewish populations in Buddhist practices, these are now practiced in a lot of different temples and synagogues. In Islam, there are opportunities too. Some of these come from the Sufi tradition. These are the teachings of Rumi, who was a 13th century Persian mystical poet. And you may know him for his followers who are the whirling dervishes, who do these dances where they spin around in white robes, and they use the paying attention to the sensations of spinning as the object of awareness for a kind of mindfulness practice. And when the mind leaves the sensations of dancing, they come back to it over and over. And while Sufism has been rejected by certain people in Orthodox Islam, among somewhat more flexibly oriented folks, there's a following of this. And I also have a patient of mine who does more traditional Islamic practice, but he simply uses the prayers as you would use them in centering prayer as part of his practice. So there are many opportunities for doing this that are compatible with people's religious beliefs and cultural orientation. Now, of course, there are many people who aren't particularly religiously oriented, and then we can simply approach these from a very scientific standpoint. We can talk about neuroplasticity. These are exercises in attentional control training. And as we've seen, there's no need to introduce a religious element into them at all. After all, the Buddhist psychology they come from is not really a religion in the traditional Western sense of the word, based on doctrine in that way. The only place where people get into a little bit of difficulty, as I've seen it, is in people who are coming from traditions that try to prohibit certain thoughts and feelings from coming up in the mind. And yet virtually all religious traditions have a loving and accepting element. And it can be very helpful simply to find clergy who emphasize this aspect of the tradition, and then we can accept it even in a rather non-religious way. So the next choice involves narrative mode versus experiential mode. And this is relevant to psychotherapy, but it's also quite relevant to any of us doing these practices. The narrative mode involves the stories we tell about ourselves. You know, in the case of psychodynamic psychotherapy, about our earlier life history and what's happening in current relationships. In the case of behavioral traditions, how did we learn our particular beliefs? And in the case of systemic or family approaches, how is it being maintained by the family, the community, and the culture? Experiencing mode is different. Experiencing mode is, instead of thinking about if I have a wave of anxiety or a wave of depression or a wave of anger, where's this coming from, what's this is all about, it's simply staying with moment to moment how it's felt in the body. And how's the mind responding to it? Is the mind trying to push it away, grasp it, or ignore it? I had a very interesting experience once where in my teaching role, I had had a communication with somebody that unfortunately, and unbeknownst to me, in a phone conversation, a student heard me say something which I didn't say and I wouldn't have said, but for whatever reason, there was this miscommunication. They were upset by it, and they were talking to other people in the program where I teach about it. And I was upset that this miscommunication had happened. And it was immediately after it happened that I went and was sitting a silent meditation retreat. But I was also teaching the retreat, so I had some opportunities for speaking. But during the first day, I was mostly just participating as a participant. And I was watching the waves come up. It would be a wave of shame that people are going to think that I'm, a bad person who would say such a thing. Waves of anger, come on, why didn't you come to me instead of talking to other people about it? Waves of fear that, now I'm going to have to figure out a skillful way to process this, and I'm not sure what would be best. And at the end of the day, I had a few minutes to talk to my old friends who were also co-leading the retreat. And they said, how have you been? And I said, well, I've been fine, except this incident happened. And I found that in simply 5 minutes of talking to them in narrative mode of what the story was, the pain around it lifted. So it illustrated to me that there's this interesting balance. Being with experiencing mode, what we do in mindfulness practice, is very, very useful for learning to be with difficult feelings. And yet stepping back and looking at things through narrative mode also can help us quite a bit. A related decision has to do with whether to stay at the level of what we might call relative or normal human truth, or to move to the level of absolute truth. The level of relative truth is simply the human story, our experiences of success and failure, pleasure and pain, longings for things that we don't have, perhaps hurt, anger, envy, joy, even pride. These are the kinds of things people come into psychotherapy talking about. Absolute truth refers to what are called in the Buddhist tradition the 3 marks of existence. I've mentioned these before, but not in quite this language. They are anicca, which is the realization that all phenomena are in constant flux. In fact, it's not even that all things change, because to even think of things as things is a little bit too reified. There's dukkha, which is this unsatisfactoriness of experience, and this is what has been poorly translated in the past as saying life is suffering. But a much better translation would be the mind often experiences dissatisfaction. Actually, my favorite presentation of this comes from a great philosopher sage. She's actually a Westerner. Sadly, she's passed away. You may know her work. She was called Rosanna. And Rosanna used to say, if it's not one thing, it's another. The sense that the mind is always unsettled about something. And the third component of absolute truth is anatta, the fact that we don't find any kind of enduring or separate self. And that's what we spoke about in an earlier lecture. Now, of course, we don't want to force it. We don't want to jump to the level of absolute truth when we haven't already processed things at the level of relative truth. I'll give you an example. If a fellow were come in to see me in psychotherapy, heartbroken because he had been engaged to marry a beautiful, warm, erotically alive, intelligent, loving woman who a few weeks before the marriage said, I just can't go through with it. If I were to say to him, well, don't you get it? It's anicca. All things change. What did you expect? Or to say, the mind creates dissatisfaction no matter what our circumstances. Had you gone through with the marriage, you'd probably be dissatisfied about something else. Just ask a married person. Or to say that the whole idea of you and your fiancé as separate selves is illusory. We're all part of one big organism. That probably wouldn't be very sensitive, and it wouldn't be very helpful. So we don't want to rush ourselves to this level of absolute truth, but we do want to allow for the possibility that when we're caught in our human drama, we can also see it through the lens of this bigger picture. Now, the last decision is arguably the most important. And this is the decision about whether to turn toward safety or turn toward the sharp points. Let me give you a little bit of history for this in the mental health field. All professions have made mistakes historically, and the mental health profession is no exception. And perhaps our biggest mistake came from clinicians extrapolating from their own experience and believing that it would be universal. So what happened, and this began, I think, in the 1950s and the 1960s, where the clinicians discovered in their own experience that part of what was healing, what they each discovered to be personally healing, was when there would be some kind of split-off affect, some feeling, some thought, even a memory, something that was painful and difficult to bear. And once they learned to be able to embrace it and to bear it, they felt a sense of transformation. A sense that now I'm whole again, now I'm not fighting these things anymore, now I feel much better. Unfortunately, what clinicians started doing was helping people who had been through serious forms of trauma or didn't have a lot of safety to start doing the very same thing. And what would happen is people would come into psychotherapy and they would become overwhelmed. This is like what I was talking about before, the idea that you have to clean out a wound first and it gets worse before it gets better if we want to move toward healing. But it has to be under a condition where the person can recover. You wouldn't want to clean out the wound when somebody's working in a dirty field. So it took some time for clinicians to realize that when people have been through difficult times or they're overwhelmed, we need to do a kind of stage-based approach to treatment. We need to first establish a sense of safety, a sense of comfort, a sense of being held. And once we have that, then we can move on to starting to reintegrate things that have been split off. Because indeed, the impulse to reintegrate is a good one. It's only when we can take back in and allow all of our feelings to occur, as we've discussed earlier, that we can become fully whole and fully present. But you can't rush it. So it turns out that some mindfulness practices are actually quite helpful for turning towards safety, while others are helpful for reintegrating the difficulties, which in the Tibetan tradition is called turning toward the sharp points. Things that are helpful for turning toward safety are typically things with an outer or distal focus. And by distal, I mean distant from the midline of the body, because when we feel feelings, we tend to feel them in here. And when difficulty arises emotionally, it tends to be in the body. So when we bring our attention outward, it works more readily for us. So one example is walking meditation. If I simply bring my attention to the sensations of the feet on the ground, it tends to ground me. In fact, in trauma treatment, these are called grounding exercises. Listening meditation also works. To simply take time and listen to whatever sounds are arising, whatever sounds are passing. Nature meditation is a nice one. That's where we go out and take a walk or do some other activity and simply pay attention to the clouds, to the sky, to the sensations of being out in the air. And eating meditation, where we pay attention to the taste of food, or open-eyed practices generally are helpful this way. There are also other ways to turn towards safety that have an inner focus. One of these is the mountain meditation, and that one you have as an audio recording included with the course. And the way the mountain meditation works is we imagine ourselves sitting as a mountain. And we're in an environment, perhaps surrounded by other mountains, like a mountain range. And what we do is we go through the seasonal changes. And it's a kind of guided imagery exercise. And we can experience all sorts of things. We can experience rain and snow coming. We can experience brilliant sky and sunshine. We can experience cold times because we go through the whole year and there might be winter and snow, and we could have warmth and birds and bees and all sorts of other activities. And the idea that comes from this is it's really an equanimity practice. We start to identify with awareness itself. We start to, rather than be identifying with the contents of the mind, it's as though the mountain is there in awareness while all these things come and go and change in and around us. I very much encourage you to try the practice. It can be very soothing, very comforting, particularly when we're going through hard times. And as we learn to identify with awareness itself, we then open much more to the full contents of the mind, even when they're difficult. Other practices that can be helpful are the loving kindness practices we talked about before, or the metta practices. May I be safe. May I be healthy. May I live with ease. Or may I be happy. May I be peaceful. May I be free from suffering. This is an inner practice, but it provides a kind of soothing that gives us a sense of safety. Finally, there are a number of practices that are derived from dialectical behavior therapy, which is a form of treatment that's used for folks with borderline personality disorder, which means a lot of dysregulation of emotional states. And these are very helpful for bringing us back into the present. And they involve things like willing hands that we'll practice a little bit later, and developing a serene half smile, and things that make us feel safe even in the midst of difficulty. Now, there's also a time when we want to turn toward the sharp points, when we want to try to reintegrate that which we've pushed out of awareness. And then we can use mindfulness practice as a kind of experiential form of treatment. You remember I talked about the narrative or the experiential. And that's where we start with something like the breath, or another object of awareness, depending on how frisky or focused the mind is. And what we do is we simply turn the attention toward anything that's unwanted or avoided. And this could be a feeling, it could be an image that comes to mind, it could be a memory. And then we simply notice, how is it experienced in the body? Whether it be pain or fear or sadness or anger, whatever it is, what's arising right now in the body? And we can see what arises in response to unwanted images or memories. We can even see what arises in response to, toward urges toward compulsive behaviors. So that if I have a feeling of, I really want to get up and go to the fridge and get that piece of chocolate cake, or I really want to have a drink right now, we can simply notice these events happening in the mind as well. So different people need different things, and any one of us needs different approaches at different moments in time. For example, when I'm choosing among the safety or the sharp points, it really depends on the day. Some days I might feel like, I want to do some kind of therapeutic work here with my mindfulness practice. Life's going okay, I'm stable enough, let me turn toward anything that I seem to be resisting, anything that's giving me difficulty. Whereas on another day I might think, gosh, I have a lot of things I have to tend to, life is chaotic, there's a lot of difficulty, let me do more of these safety-oriented exercises. And sometimes that's simply in the course of a day, or sometimes it's over a long period of time. We might go through a period where we've had a lot of difficulty in our lives, where we think, a lot of loving kindness practice, a lot of equanimity practice, I just need to have some sense of stability here, and I'll do the integrative work later when I'm ready for it. Now, I'd like to particularly emphasize when mindfulness of inner experience can be harmful. And by this I mean when simply spending a long period of time just staying with the breath can be a problem. When we're overwhelmed by traumatic memories, as I've suggested. Also, when we're afraid of disintegration or loss of sense of self. And that may sound a little odd, but sometimes people go through periods in which they kind of feel, they're noticing all of the different parts that we've talked about before, but it's making them very anxious. And they're feeling, gosh, I don't know who I am anymore. And sometimes there's a sort of loss of sense of self that happens. I don't know if it's your feeling or my feeling that I'm experiencing. When people are having those kinds of difficulties, it's not a good time to do the turning toward the sharp points or the staying with the breath for a long period of time. And also when people are suffering from psychosis, because it's just too easy to get caught in the narrative stream when this happens. So there are some practices that we could think of as life preservers, and I want to give you an example from a clinical experience I had of how this can work. Basically, life preservers are about using the practices that turn us towards safety and doing them in a very difficult moment. And usually these involve some form of concentration practice that includes stepping out of the thought stream. I'll give you an example. There was a woman who I'd been working with for some time, and she had had a really, really bad trauma history. When I first met her and started hearing about it, I started thinking initially, gosh, maybe she has trouble identifying what's real and what isn't. Maybe she has a serious mental illness of some sort. Because the stories she was telling me about her childhood were so bad that I thought, this couldn't have happened, could it? Wouldn't a teacher have said something? Wouldn't a neighbor have done something? Wouldn't the police have been called? I'll spare you the details, but it was really horrible things. Anyway, I came to know her over time, and I realized that there was a lot of internal consistency to her stories, that indeed, probably what she remembered was the truth. Part of the way I discovered this, or come to believe this, is by hearing about other elements that fit together. For example, she had, I know this sounds terrible, but it's true. She had a brother who had committed suicide after he had done some terrible things. And there were other elements that all held together to make me believe that indeed this person did have a terrible, terrible childhood. Anyway, because of this terrible past, she would be prone to all sorts of instability. And one day she came into my office with a symptom that I've got to think is unique to the Boston metropolitan area. She came in and said that everywhere in her visual field that day, she was seeing 2 to 3 foot high Red Sox players. And they had the bats and the balls and the full regalia. Very unusual symptom. Usually when somebody has a symptom like that, we think it has to do with an organic problem, drugs or a metabolic issue. But in her case, I think it was just because of her bad trauma. And I started asking her what had happened, and indeed she had had an experience earlier in that day where somebody had spoken to her harshly. And because of the horrible violence she had been exposed to, this kind of thing would unnerve her, and I knew from past experience that it could produce all sorts of symptoms. So after talking about that and coming to some understanding of it, I asked her if she'd like to try something different, and this is where the life preservers come in. I asked her to stand up at the window with me and look out, and outside the window there was a tree. Not a particularly bucolic tree, but nonetheless there was a tree. And I just asked her to look at the tree and bring her attention to it. And here's where the mindfulness instruction came in. I suggested that she look at the tree and not try to get rid of the Red Sox players. In mindfulness practice, we're not trying to get rid of anything, but rather to simply be with the tree and notice all of its textures, its colors, and she could even describe them. And then we went on to look at the houses and other things. And ultimately, she started to feel somewhat calmer and, importantly, somewhat safer. She was still a little unsteady, so I asked her in between sessions, I was ending one session, I said, why don't you go walk around the neighborhood, it was a safe neighborhood and a nice day, and continue this practice of just bringing your attention out while allowing the Red Sox players to be there, but continuing to notice that there's the safe external reality. And she did this over time and came back after the next session, and she felt comfortable enough to drive home, felt pretty stable, she did that. I called her up that evening, and she was still having the experience of the Red Sox players, but she was feeling considerably calmer. I thought I'd better check in, and I called her the next morning, and the Red Sox players were gone. I don't know, maybe they had an away game, but they weren't bothering her anymore. And these kinds of things won't always work, but it's interesting to know that we can turn to these practices of the outer world in order to get a sense of safety. So all of these decisions can be helpful in modifying our practices to work with the situation at hand. In our next lecture, we're going to look at some of the rapidly expanding research into how mindfulness practices affect the brain. How old notions that the brain matures around age 25 and just decays thereafter are being turned upside down by the results of research on mindfulness. Thanks for listening.